Um, Thank you all for coming today, and a special thanks to Jenny Zhao, our alum speaker, who has put a lot of work into this presentation. We've been back and forth over the last couple months, and I know she has a lot of wonderful things to share with you. Jenny, as I've mentioned in my email to all of you, is a born investigator, starting from the time that she was sitting in one of these seats here at Stony Brook. She went on right from Stony Brook to Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, where she was in a specialized investigative reporting program within Columbia. And then she went on from there. I believe your first job was at Center for Public Integrity?
No, I worked at a very tiny daily in South Carolina. I was one of 5 reporters.
Wow, that's great training. And then you went on from there to the Center for Public Integrity, yes? Mm-hmm. Which is a nonprofit investigative reporting operation. And her new job, fairly new still, is as an investigative reporter in the Washington Bureau of the Los Angeles Times. One of 2 alums we have at that fine newspaper, I will add. So Jenny, thank you so much for all the time and effort you've put into this and for being here today. And we have with us on Zoom several current students and alums who are interested in learning more about public records research. And with that, I'm going to add a few more students, a few more alums we have here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I should just start sharing my screen, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And people who are on Zoom, you can put questions in the chat. We'll mostly deal with them at the end of the presentation, but if you find yourself getting lost, I'll be monitoring the chat. And students, you can text me if you have any questions. Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Jenny.
First off, can you guys see my screen?
We can hear.
Okay, yeah. Awesome. That's 100% of the difficulty of this thing. Yeah, so like Professor Sullivan said, I was an alum. I'm an alum. I was a student just like you guys, class of 2012. I am excited to teach you guys about public records today because it's truly something I use every day. My first records request ever was when I was in Stony Brook, and it was the university, and the university told me to kick rocks, and I never got anything back. So hopefully after this course today, you will not be discouraged and you will have much more success than I did. So just consider this sort of an introduction to public records. I'm by no means an expert. I'm just going to share with you guys some things that I've learned myself. And like the professor said, I'm just going to try to get through this presentation as quick as possible so that we have tons of time for questions after. Let me see if I can hide this. I wonder if that is in the way. Okay. All right. So I think, public records are something that you can use on deadline and if you have a lot of time, right? So when you guys think of public records, I'm sure you guys are thinking of this stuff, right? It's a lot of paper, a lot of redactions, everything's blacked out, good luck reading this thing over here. But also public records go beyond just stacks of paper, right? So you've got text messages, you've got salary and payroll and data information. You've got 911 call transcripts. With the Surfside Tower collapse in Miami, you have, reports and investigations and photographs about the damage. Of course, you've got body cam footage, which has become a really big one in recent years. And then my personal favorite is emails. And in addition, the emails here about the Flint water crisis, right? So all of this stuff is also public records. And theoretically, all this stuff you can also get from a public records request. I want to kind of lay out a case for you guys. Why even bother with public records requests? You've probably heard that it takes a lot of time, pain in the ass, both those things are true. But there's also, a lot of reasons why you would want to go and actually file a records request. And here are just some of the reasons, right? You can really use records requests in a variety of ways. Everything that you think might exist as a public record is something that is potentially subject to a public records request. And also, don't just think of records as data. Like I said, they can be visual, they can be video, they can be text messages, and they can also be like pretty interesting narratives, right? So hopefully and I think the most important reason is because you can. As reporters, there's so few things we are guaranteed in life, in the profession, but public records is one area where you really can just go ahead and file a records request, and that is available to you as a matter of law. So keep that in mind. And I just want to give you some examples of like where records requests can really shine. And I want to focus on, I think, examples that are very achievable, right? I'm not going to talk about the massive records dumps that the New York Times, ProPublica, the Washington Post, even the LA Times that we do. A lot of these things can start off really small or really off of the news. So this is an example of a story in the Boston Globe about a professor actually who fell to their death because of a stairwell that was broken. And what the reporter did in this case was actually file a request to see whose responsibility was it that it actually had been inspected. And they found a paper trail that showed, in fact, they'd known about the situation at the stairwell, right? So this is a situation where you have something that obviously happened, and then you go back and see, okay, well, could this have been avoided? Who was responsible? And that's a pretty quick example of something that you can do pretty much on the fly. And then, of course, you have some more complicated situations. And this is a situation involving the lieutenant governor of Alaska in Anchorage. And basically, during the 2020 run-up to election, there were a lot of people saying, oh, no one trusts the whole mail-in ballot situation. How can you, trust that it's credible? And this was sort of a very common claim from a lot of, I would say, a fair number of Republican jurisdictions or Republican politicians. Well, the Associated Press decided to actually fact check this guy who was complaining that they were getting up to 20 emails a day. Everybody was so upset. And then, well, the AP actually looked into it. Turns out they got like less than 20 emails in total. So this is actually a really good example of fact check whatever politicians or people in power are saying. And surprise, surprise, there's a fair amount of stretching of truth going on. Here's another example where you can really do this not, quickly on deadline and in ways that maybe you're not thinking of. So if you remember at the end of last year, you had those really deadly tornado going down south. And of course, well, actually this is in the Midwest. But anyway, in this situation, it was really deadly situation. And there was a bunch of labor stories coming out about people who were caught up in the tornado and people who were not in a good situation. And obviously it's a breaking news story, but what this reporter decided to do is also file a records request on deadline looking for 911 call transcripts. And you can get that, and you can really get sort of narrative and details that might be otherwise really difficult to get. And this is a really sort of particularly devastating narrative here. This is an example that I did. At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, there was just so much we did not know what was happening. I would still say there's a lot of things we still aren't sure about what's happening. And in this case, we wanted to know at the LA Times what was going on in the meat packing factories over in California. Meat packing is a really, really dangerous job. Everything that we know about meat packing would indicate that a contagious illness would only make it worse. And so we basically filed records requests targeting a specific meat packing sector to see what the lag was in between when a company was actually first reporting the problem and when they actually told officials about the problem, and vice versa. And there was a fair amount of confusion very early on because there weren't a lot of rules. It was sort of like the Wild Wild West. And it was this really particular situation. There were several workers who ended up dying from COVID. And there was a lot of, the emails were super interesting. There were back and forth messages between the union and the company and the health authorities, all trying to figure out how they could shut down the factory because of just how many people were getting sick. So this is also something I would say we did on a relatively quick turnaround. And then, of course, there are just truly, truly bizarre situations. I highly encourage you all to Google this just because it's so bizarre and strange. But this is the situation where a reporter at the Post-Dispatch in St. Louis basically found a security flaw on the state website, and they decided to tell the state, hey, you have a security flaw and you guys are actually leaking a lot of personal private information on the website. And then the state was originally going to be like, oh my God, thank you so much for telling us about this really rookie mistake that we made. But then the Missouri officials sort of took like a hard 180 pivot and decided to accuse the reporter and the paper of essentially hacking into their system. But it's such a bizarre thing. And of course, because the newspaper was in this rare position of having to write about itself, what did they do? They filed a records request to figure out what changed. And funny enough, originally before the politicians got involved, they were just going to thank the newspaper and the reporter for finding that issue. And then once politics became involved, I guess whoever was in charge of that decision decided they could turn the newspaper into some kind of weird living example. We live in very bizarre times. So this is an example of just, you can really go back and just see what was their reasoning, what was their thinking at that time. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you guys all that public records requests are totally doable, totally worth your time. Look at all the stuff that you can get. So how does it actually work, right? So you start with the law. Open records laws are going to differ wildly by state and by country. Here in the United States, we have a federal law, which everyone refers to as FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. And then each state actually has their own version of that law. And they will differ wildly. I've actually have filed records requests in every US state and territory. And I'm always surprised constantly still about what different states allow you to get and what others don't. And so basically the law will spell out who can request a record, what you are and aren't entitled to, how long it's going to take, how long it's going to cost you, right? And RCFP, which is the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, they're a great group. They actually keep up-to-date open government guides. So whenever I file a request, I literally go to this website first, I find the state, and I just kind of scroll through, and it tells me right away, what can I request, what can I not request, how long is this going to take, blah, 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 blah. So RCFP has them for every state, and they also have them for the federal law, which is FOIA. So I highly recommend starting with the law first, just so that you can get your idea of what you can actually request, right? So once you've gone and done that, you'll see for New York State, since you guys are all in New York State today, or I should assume at least the people present in the class. So it really goes in depth. And if you notice here, their government guides tend to actually be written by actual attorneys, which is great. They actually have a contact number here. I haven't actually tried contacting the people who've written these guides, but I'm assuming their numbers are here for a reason. And if you can see on the left-hand side of the New York page, just all these little things that you can click through, and it can get really, really, really granular. For instance, you can, let's say you're interested in body cam footage or autopsies, you could actually just do a Control F or scroll through the side, and it'll tell you automatically right off the bat, what can you get in New York, what can you not get in New York. So just real fast, right? We're just looking at New York right now. This doesn't apply to New Jersey or Connecticut or any other state. This is just New York, right? And it's called, New York's law is called the Freedom of Information Law. It's commonly referred to it as FOIL. And the things that you can get in New York, right, includes the governor's office records, which I'm sure former Governor Andrew Cuomo did not love the fact that his office was subject to records requests. I've actually tried to request records from his office several times, and his office was also very pretty micromanaging when it came to public records. And then you can also get public salary and payroll data. Something unique about New York is that you also can get gun permit information, which I can tell you off the bat, it's not the case in a lot of other states. And you can also get 911 tapes, and you can also get arrest records. Believe it or not, you can't actually get all this stuff in every state. Some things that you cannot get through records request, right? Typically speaking, you can't get court information, and that is because court records by default in most jurisdictions are open. Meaning if I went to the courthouse and I pulled records, I actually did do this last week, you do not have to file records requests for a court document because the court records themselves were supposed to be public. In New York State, you cannot get autopsies and coroner's reports, which I would say is different from California. I have filed for those in California. And then, of course, things like disciplinary records. So if you wanted to get a cop or politicians or a civil servant's disciplinary records, some of those might be open, some of those might not be. Then you have investigatory records. So if I wanted to look at an internal affairs investigation, there's going to be a limit to how much I can get from that. This is all to say that, you know, when in doubt, and most of the time you will be in doubt because most things fall in gray areas, just go ahead and request it, because you're going to be able to see upfront what you can and cannot get, and that's not always super clear. So this is just a sample of what you can and you can't get. And even in here, I would say there's some crossover here. A lot of governor's office records, they'll say, well, it's pending an investigation, et cetera, et cetera. But this is all just to say, hey, if you want it and you think you can get it, just go ahead and file for it. Okay, so if I haven't lost you guys all already, let's actually file some requests, right? So as Professor Sullivan said, she and I have been talking for a little while, and I was thinking to myself, well, how could I make this relevant for students, right? Let's file some records requests to Stony Brook. You know, I'm a little salty. Like I said, my first time filing records requests was as an SBU student. It was to Stony Brook University. Stony Brook University actually told me, hey, you know, we're not going to give you any records. I don't remember what I was requesting, but I found out much later after I had graduated that they were like totally wrong and they were supposed to give me those records. But anyway, I was like, you know what, I'm still salty. Let's file some requests today, right? So technically 1 month ago. So I ended up filing 2 requests to Stony Brook. The first request, you guys are probably familiar with Title IX, right? So most, if not all, universities are subject to Title IX. It's a federal provision on reporting of, well, there's reportings of various things, but in this case, I really wanted to focus on sexual assault. You can, if you're interested in Title IX, which if you guys are all university students, this has been, you know, a huge, huge story, not just on college campuses, but I would just say in general. I've linked a course here to Pointers, sort of crash course on Title IX for student journalists, and then also EWA, which is also another group, the Education Writers Association, I think that's what it stands for, their guide on how to investigate sexual assault under Title IX. So Stony Brook actually has a Title IX website, and it says here, you know, kind of what the university is mandated to do. And here I am showing you the basic anatomy of a FOIL request. Now, every person I've ever met who routinely does this, and I would say most journalists in general, are going to have to file records requests at some point. They all have their own little templates and boilerplates that they use. This is mine. Mine tends to be a little extra because I'm a little extra. Yours does not need to be this extra. But the basic thing that you need to include in there are the date of your letter. That's very important because it starts the clock ticking. You have to address it to a records officer. It doesn't always need to be a person. You have to specify the format, right? So I say here electronic machine readable. What does that mean? Please don't send me images of documents, which, believe it or not, that is what most agencies do. So they'll actually send you a photo of text, which is fun because when you try to actually copy and paste the text off of the document, you cannot because it's a photo. And electronic, meaning please, for the love of God, in the year 2022, do not send me paper. Everything more or less these days are digital files, and that means you can send an electronic file to me. And then the next part is obviously pretty important, date range. So I want, right, Title IX records, but I want them, and I want it to be pretty reasonable with them in a short amount of time, right? So I said, okay, just give me what you have on this from the last year. And then I said to the date you processed this request, which is a fancy way of saying, if you take a really, really long time to process my request, you'll have to make sure to give me all the records up until the very date that you complete my request. And that basically just ensures that the records you have are the most up to date, right? And so then I list out in bullet points what I want, right? And I often include links and examples, any kind of detail you want to include to help the person whose sad job is going to be to actually help you get these records back. And so in this case, I'm assuming because of the way Title IX is, is a federal mandate, and it's a really complicated situation, most universities typically are tracking this in some type of format, whether some kind of spreadsheet, some kind of table, some kind of database. And then I said, including but not limited to. Including but not limited to is probably my favorite legalese phrase. It's basically like you're able to specify something without being able to be like, but not just that, also give me more of this. And so that's why I also use etc. Etc. is also one of my favorite phrases. And so the second half of my request, right, is kind of what I call the fine print. And again, my letters tend to be pretty extra. But I basically say, hey, if you're going to give me these records, please give me everything else that I'm going to need to understand what the hell it is you've given me. I can't count the number of times I've gotten databases from, especially federal agencies, and everything is literally written in government code, meaning every column is like LWCKW. And I'm like, what is that? And then they're like, well, don't you know what that means? And I'm like, no, I don't know what that means. So they're supposed to send you what's called data dictionaries to actually help you understand how that database or those records were kind of put together. This is typically more the case when you're dealing with requests for data. This other portion here is please provide records in severable portions as they become available. It's a fancy way of saying, please don't take forever. So oftentimes, most places, they won't give you a single page until they've gone and reviewed and redacted all the pages. And so I'm trying to tell you here, just give me the pages as they become available. And so that's called batches. I actually received a batch earlier this morning of 2,900 pages for a records request I have pending in a lawsuit. So these other parts, also fine print, really important. If you decide to withhold an exempt portion of any record, please release all other severable parts. This is a really complicated way of saying, hey, if you decide not to give me something, you got to give me everything else, meaning you can black out a whole page, but if there is a header on that page or some other information on that page that does not need to be redacted, you have to give me that. And if you're going to redact and withhold tons of records to me, you've got to tell me exactly how many you withheld. For example, the 2,900 pages I received today, there was approximately 200 additional pages I didn't get at all because they have withheld it, which means they did not give it to me at all. But they had to tell me how many of those pages are. And then this is my favorite part, my most important part, because I'm a cheapo, which is if there are any search, review, or duplication fees greater than $10, please inform me before you fill the request. This is really important because newsrooms, as you guys probably know, we're not like, running over filled with cash, right? So in general, most requests, I will say fees are reasonable, but every now and then you will get really, really insane estimates. I've gotten quotes anywhere from $500 to $3,000, $10,000. Obviously, I'm not paying $10,000. But basically, this is basically saying, if this is more than $10, you better call me first because I'm not going to pay more than $10. And then, of course, your contact information. I always like to put a phone number, an email address, and then that way the government can't be like, but we couldn't reach you. And I'm going to be like, yes, you could reach me. Look at all these ways you can reach me. So I sent this off to the university, and this is what I got back, right? So they emailed me back. First off, Doug Panico. Not sure if you guys work with him. He's actually a really nice guy. And here's a couple things they put in the reply, right? So they've got, this letter acknowledges my receipt. We're going to search, yada, yada, yada. Will take no longer than 20 business days from the date of this acknowledgement, right? So this is basically like, hey, we got your request. We're going to get back to you once the statutory time frame has passed. 20 business days, that's important. Can't count weekends, can't count federal holidays or anything like that, right? So now what, right? So this is the longest portion. Some reporters, they like to keep track of the records request every week. Some reporters wait until the statutory time frame has passed. In this case, I tried to get in touch with Doug or anyone from the university with 2 weeks before the 20-day deadline was up. I wasn't getting anywhere. I kept emailing them. I called them, nothing, right? Just nothing. And then 20 business days later, I was pretty annoyed. This was February 10th, so this was literally just a few weeks ago. I was like, hey, Doug, and you notice here, this is like my angry red, bold, and caps. You will always be able to tell how annoyed I am in any email by how much color, text, bolded text I use. I said, hey, Doug, I left you a second voicemail. I haven't been able to get in touch with you or Kathy, and now you're telling me you're not going to be able to make the 20 business day time frame, and you're asking for more time. Please give me a call below, or give me the contact information for the appeals officer. I'll mention the appeals later. Okay, so this is 1:33 p.m., right? It's pretty annoying. You know, I never spoke with Doug before, wasn't able to get a hold of him. This is my 4th email to him with no response. I'm pretty annoyed, right? Okay. 23 minutes later. Hi, Doug. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me. So in between, within that 23-minute time span of me sending that email, Doug actually called me right away. He is actually a very nice man. And he said he was very slammed. He's got a backlog. I also told Doug, I totally get it, but you know what? You know, I file these things all the time. And, you know, I have yet to talk to any record person who is just, you know, does not have a backlog and has so much time. And he actually laughed at this, which is great, because like you wanna sort of walk a fine line of being, I think, tough, but then also like be nice. And honestly, Doug seems like such a nice guy. At the end of the day, I'm doing my job, he's doing his job, and you know, all you want to do is just sort of meld those two together, but like also know that the law is on your side. And so, you know, after he and I spoke, he told me where he was at. He was like, look, I'm not gonna just keep extending this, because what happens a lot of times is the 20 business days pass and then you don't hear a peep from the agency, and then at the end of the 20 days they come back to you going like, oh, you know what, I think we need another 20 business days. And I'm like, oh, friggin' please. And so like he told me, no, that's not going to be the case. This next date I'm giving you is going to be the real date. We're working on it. What's important though is that I was able to get Doug on the phone, which confirms, 1, he is a real life person, 2, that he's actually actively working on my request, and he knows that I care about this request. A lot of people file requests and sometimes they forget they file requests, and so a lot of the times people actually processing their requests are like, hey, I don't think this person remembers, so who knows, what if I don't work on it? You know, that's happened a lot before too. So, and also 3, it opened a communication between Doug and myself so that I could get a sense of where he is. And after he and I spoke on the phone, he started emailing me and started to work with me on what the tough parts of my request was going to be, and the not so tough parts of my request. Now, the Title IX request was the first request I sent him. I sent him another request that I thought would be maybe a little bit more fun for you guys. And that request is actually, I wanted communications. I wanted email communications from the university's public relations department, because it's my understanding from Professor Selvin that Lauren Shapro, who is actually the same spokesman I was subjected to as a J school student, recently left. So I've always been curious how Stony Brook University handles records requests. And so you can actually do that. So my second request is looking for all the communications within the public relations division at Stony Brook about how they handle and flag records requests. So both of those should be theoretically coming back, right? According to the university officials, according to Doug, and I trust Doug because he and I have spoken now, right? Like, we're simpatico, right? So he claims I will receive records to the Title IX request March 4th, and then a few days later, also the records in regards to my communications request for the public relations division. So I'm telling you guys this to say, if I get stuff back March 4th, I will try to forward that to Professor Selvin, and it is free game for you guys. what you want to make of Title IX records, and also that situation, and the public relations thing as well. So March 4th should be, I believe, what is it? It's this Friday. So we'll see. Okay. So just to recap, right? Like I said, you want to be persistent, but you want to be kind, right? A lot of the times, these folks that are working on records requests, it's not their full-time job most of the time, unless you're dealing with the federal government where it is their full-time job. Like I said, try to call them, you know. I always try to hash everything out over email so that there's a written record of it, but it is also really important to call them so that you really make sure it's front of mind, right? Be open to narrowing your request. That just always is a lot of this stuff goes as negotiation. And also, like, you've got to make yourself available. And like I said, you can go real extra like me, enumerate and bold the crap out of your emails. I've added read receipts. I've marked as important, which are things that you can use on Outlook on the email, so that the other person on the other end is like, oh, this person really wants me to read this email. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, but you know what? Worth a shot, right? And some cool little extras about New York's Freedom of Information Act. New York's law is, I think, one of the better ones. So New York actually has a Committee on Open Government, and this is an agency actually. Most states don't have this, so I would highly recommend that if you guys are having trouble with any records request that you file in New York State, whether that's New York City, New York State, or any jurisdictions in Long Island, right? You are enfranchised to reach out to the Committee on Open Government, and the Committee on Open Government, their staffers, not all of them, but a couple of them, are attorneys who actually work on public records access and open meetings access. And so you can actually call them. Oh, there's a typo on here. Oh, there's a hotline. Whoops. And let me go back. There's a hotline, and you can actually call them during business hours, and just kind of, if you run into a really tough situation or you're not sure what to make of an agency's response, you can go ahead and call them. And then they also keep advisory opinions, which is like, all of this is to say is that records requests are not like a static thing, right? It's a dynamic area of law. People are constantly filing lawsuits. People are constantly, duking it out in the courts. And so what was once not subject to disclosure under records requests later does become subject to disclosure. And then and all these things get built up over time, over legal precedents, right? So you might run into a situation where you're dealing with an agency that's like, no, the thing that you're asking for is totally not releasable. And you're like, okay, but can you cite me the law that says I can't get that? And then they're like, no, I can't, but we definitely are not allowed to give you that. So then in that situation, I would call up the New York Committee on Open Government and be like, this is what this agency is telling me. Can you tell me, is that true? And they might actually point you to previous advisory opinions where certain things were released or not released. And that's case law, right? And the last thing about the Committee on Open Government, which I actually found this out from the Committee on Open Government a few years back, is that in New York, you can actually ask an agency to certify that the record that they've given you is correct. What this means is I've actually filed a lot of records requests to New York State when I was covering the prison system a few years ago. So the New York State Department of Corrections a couple years ago. And every time I filed a request, their initial gut instinct was like, nah, you can't get that. It's not releasable. And they would always fail to cite what part of the law that said, hey, the thing that I want, I can't actually get. And they would never be able to do it. So they just kept doing this every freaking time. and they would just deny. And then I was like, this record exists, first they told me I couldn't have it, then they told me the record doesn't exist. So then I went back to the agency and I said, okay, it doesn't exist. Can you certify that that is a true and accurate statement? Meaning, can you actually certify to the fact that the thing I'm asking for, which is a very basic record, does not exist, which is like embarrassing. So basically, this is like a very fancy way of saying, can you attest to the completeness of what you're saying you've given me, right? So, there's a lot of legal mumbo jumbo and all this, but if you really break it down, if you really think that what you're asking for exists, and for some reason the agency's like, nah, it doesn't exist, you can always go back to them and be like, you willing to certify to that? And most of the time after the fact, they'll be like, oh, that looks really bad that we say that we don't have this basic record. So then they usually come back to you and actually give you what they have. And that's the situation that happened to me. So my takeaways would be, embrace your inner skeptic, right? I mean, just because an agency tells you something, don't feel inclined to think that's automatically 100% truth, right? You're all journalists, so I'm assuming your skepticism is finely honed, but especially with records requests, you're gonna get a lot of people who tell you, oh, you can't get that. Still to this day, I have so many people when I'm dealing with records requests being like, yeah, you can't get that. And I'm like, nah, I've gotten it before from your agency. And they're like, no, you can't. And I'm like, but I'm pretty sure I can. So over time, you're going to develop this expertise, but do not be afraid to push back, right? And I was telling Professor Salvin this because, she and I, in sort of developing this course, we were trying to figure out, do journalists really need to know how to file records requests? And my answer was absolutely yes. And the way I kind of phrased it to her was, look, if you can ask a spokesperson a question, right? If you have the time and the gumption to like file an email to a spokesperson who, by the way, they are under absolutely no legal obligation to respond to you or even to tell you the truth, right? If you can get in contact with the spokesperson, you can file a records request too. Once you've gotten your template and your boilerplate in hand, I literally just go into a Google Doc where I have these and I just tweak it for whatever request I'm whatever type of record that I want. And that process can literally take me 2 seconds, right? Like a minute or two to like send an email, right? So once you get into the habit of filing these every now and then, they don't become as onerous and they don't become like such a big deal. And in fact, they do become quite routine. So I would encourage you guys to see this as just another element of your reporting. It's another tool to add, and it's something that you should really just consider weaving into everything that you do. And I would say be your own expert, right? It's much easier to know if the person on the other end if what they're telling you is correct if you've already done the research and you know that record that you want is for sure releasable, that they for sure have it, and of course every reporter has their own style. I tend to be more on the aggressive side, which is probably not fortunate for poor people, for Doug Panigo, who's a very nice man. But I like to really watch my records requests closely, but also at the same time, be professional, be courteous, but also don't let people roll over you, right? And the last thing is ask for help, right? I still do this to this day. I have literally filed hundreds of these things over the years, and every now and then I will get a response where I'm like, huh? And it truly just a brain tickler, because it's just like, what is this person even saying? And so a lot of the times I will actually get on Twitter or my other sort of journalism, listservs and things like that if I really run into a pickle situation and I'm just like, what the hell is this? And so constantly, this might seem counterintuitive because of how competitive journalists tend to be, but I would say investigative journalists maybe not so much, but like we try to help each other a lot with these kind of situations. So always ask for help, and always try to figure out kind of where you're at. I will say this, I've been filing records requests throughout my whole career, starting from that, small daily newspaper that I worked for straight out of grad school, where it was me and 4 other reporters, right, running a daily newspaper, which sounds ridiculous, but I mean, it was ridiculous. And I filed records requests there all the time, and I was the county government reporter. A lot of the times it's a formality, but it's a formality I would say a lot of people in government expect you as a reporter to know. So there were instances where if I were to ask the police chief, it was actually a police sheriff when you got to know when I was working there. If I asked him just as over email, can you give me this report? He'd be like, nah, I can't do that.
I have a good one.
Me too.
Thank you.
But if
I
my
remember that, but it wasn't even
experience
going
later
in at all.
on was to be like, let me file a record request to that same sheriff and ask him for that same report, then he'll be like, oh yeah, okay, I'll give it to you. So a lot of the times it's like this inherent contrast where they want to see how
No, it's just open.
sophisticated you are in terms of knowing how to file these records requests. So a lot of the times it is a formality, but it's a formality that requires the agency to do something for you. And honestly, in all the times that you're reporting, you really are not entitled to much as a reporter, right? I know in J school, they're like, teach you, you're a reporter, you have a right to be there, you have a right to observe, et cetera, et cetera. That's all true. But at the end of the day, if a spokesperson doesn't email you back, or if a police chief doesn't answer your questions, or a politician tells you to go kick rocks, there's like not a lot you can do, right? This is an area and a realm where you actually do have legal standing to ask for something and for the other person on the other end to grant you a response of some kind. And so I would highly recommend you guys do this for the smallest reason, which is because you should feel empowered to do it, and you can do it. So I think that concludes what I was trying to say. Oh man, there you go, Zar. Hope I haven't bored you guys all, but I think we're at time, which is 3:30. And then I was just gonna open it up to questions if you guys have any questions.
Thanks, Jenny. We can probably stop screen sharing now and see you.
Yes.
This would be good. Great. Okay, that was wonderful. Thank you. So opening it up to questions. I know some of you who are here on Zoom are out in the world working as reporters and are maybe trying to do some investigations and might have some questions about specific stories that you're working on, or specific experiences that you've had, or where can you go, generally speaking, to find what you need. So Brianne or Gary or Paula, I know Paula, you've been doing some investigative stuff dealing with labor issues for the More Perfect Union website. So open it up to all of you. You can put it in the chat, or you can just raise your hand or start speaking. I don't think there's a lot of competition for the mic right now.
So I'm curious, how many of you guys have actually successfully filed a records request?
Successfully? No.
I know success is like hard to measure with these things, right? Yeah. Well, did the person tell you to like piss off, or like did they give you some kind of response back, I guess? Yeah.
Generally, generally the response was piss off. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, this was some time ago. I don't recall the details, but yeah, it's a fun process.
I want to enfranchise people because you know what, like a spokesperson can do the same exact thing to you, but the one thing is you can't cite back law to the spokesperson being like, actually you have to respond to me, right? So this is one of the few arenas, like I said, where you guys can really actually push back. You know, Doug was not reachable for like the most of the 20 business days. And then once I just sort of took things up a notch, he called me within 20 minutes, right? So there's ways you can do it. And obviously like Doug is still promising me records at the end of this week. So I will share whatever I get with the students. But yeah, I mean, so you guys feel pretty confident filing records requests? Those of you who have? It's like a
We have a
process that
question
works.
in the chat from Brianne Letta, who is working for weekly newspapers on the North Fork of Long Island and covering town governments. And she asks, let's say you're a local reporter and you've built up a repertoire with a lot of sources at town hall. There are a lot of records already publicly available. Can there be fallout when applying for records? How do you decide when it's worth it? Like, are you going to alienate your sources by making them go through this formally?
Right. I mean, I really think that depends because I had the same situation when I was working in a small county, right? A small place. I knew all the council members. They would text me stuff, right? I still file records requests. I would tell them, hey, you can give this to me now or I can file a records request. Either way, you know, I mean, I think to your point, can there be fallout? Yes, but anytime there can be fallout just from any form of reporting, right? I feel like in this case, if they're public servants, they already are advised when they join public government that their emails and that their information is going to be subject potentially to disclosure. Trust me, they all get trained about this, even at the very small county level. I was in nowhere, South Carolina, and even they were very familiar with what emails I could get, what I could, you know, what I was privy to. So I think it's hard to decide when it's worth it. I think worth it is hard to say because records requests, like I said, they can be very routine, very, very quick. Now, if you risk kind of alienating them, no, like I said, they're all taught that this is part of what happens when you go into public service. So they should expect that. If you want to give them a heads up, you can go ahead, but it's not going to do anything for them. What are they going to start doing? Deleting emails? I guess they could. That could be a friggin' lawsuit later. But basically, I would say absolutely you should be requesting records. And I would say maybe you don't got to do it all the time, but maybe focus on doing it on the times where you feel like you are not getting a clear answer. So things that are very controversial, things that you know did not play out the way they said they did, those are the ones I would bother trying to request records from. And if they come back to you being like, why did you ask for my emails? And be like, well, you know, I asked you what happened and none of you guys were telling me what was happening. So I had to go ahead and file this records request. I mean, it does kind of make you a bit of a pain in the ass, but you know what? I mean, what is reporting, right? I mean, you're not out here to be friends with people. You're out here to find out what the hell happened. And if they're not going to tell you, or if you have doubts about what they're telling you is actually true, go ahead and file a records request. And what do they say? Don't what is it? Beg for forgiveness or whatever. Like just do it. Later on, you just damage control.
Right. We have a question in the class, so I'm going to turn my laptop so you can see Raphael.
It's not actually a question. It's just because she asked about if we had gotten like public records before. I didn't get public records, but once by accident, I ended up getting a record from a private company. And that happened when I was in high school. I am an international student from Brazil. And when I was in my high school, they didn't really have a newspaper, but I helped them covering some things that happened. I was literally the only student doing that. And I don't know if here in the United States, this was a news or not, but in my state, there was a dam rupture that ruptured. I think it was international news here. Yes. And like, that was literally on my state and I covered that. And I talked to a person from like it was not from the company that the dam was owned by, it was from another company. But then this person literally just sent me, oh, this is our like plan. And it was like a very private document that she shouldn't have sent me. And like when I told that to the media person in my high school, she was like, oh yeah, if this was like an actual newspaper, you would probably have been like promoted or something. But because it is like just a high school thing, we're not gonna publish it. But that happened with me by accident once. And
Oh, that happens all the time. Police departments in particular keep giving me stuff I'm not supposed to have. I mean, they're supposed to redact things like social security numbers and like private information from a lot of these records requests. I cannot tell you how many social security numbers I've received. So like in that moment as a reporter, you've got to also be careful. Just because an agency was kind of callous on how gave records to you doesn't mean that I'm going to go ahead and like publish those records as is, or that I'm going to go out and steal these people's identities whose social security numbers I now have, right? So I think that happens, unfortunately, a lot of the times. I've had federal government give me stuff that I'm not supposed to have, but at the end of the day, like that happens with journalism too. I mean, so just be careful. Just be more responsible than the agency that you were working with. Let's put it that way.
We have a couple more questions in the chat. We have two from Sarah Ruberg, who is one of our seniors, and she's the current editor-in-chief of the Statesman. Are emails between public government and private emails accessible, or have you found that changes from state to state?
Yes, the answer is yes. So that's a fun workaround, right? I have to deal with a lot of private companies. Private entities are typically not subject to records requests. However, if any part of the communication goes through a public entity, then you can get it. So I've done this a lot. So for instance, I was dealing with a lot of oil and gas companies, huge companies. They don't want you to know what they're doing, right? They're private companies, right? Well, they deal a lot with federal regulators. And a lot of the times, unfortunately, a lot of federal regulators can get really, really cozy with these companies. And sometimes I was getting these emails about like them attending barbecues at each other's houses and things like that. I was like, I don't know why I have that. But it's also a question of why do those exist, right? So yes, if you can capture, a lot of the times, some of the smartest sort of reporters when it comes to records requests, really truly genius moves is when people think, how can I report about this private entity, but they're not subject to FOIA, but you know what, this agency that they work with all the time is. And a lot of the times you can capture that conversation. Remember, conversations are not strictly private to private, public to public, right? For instance, when I was talking about the coronavirus pandemic, right? I was writing about private meatpacking factories, right? They're all privately owned, Smithfield, Purdue, all these companies, right? I wanted to know what was happening in a private setting, but I ended up seeing that they were talking to a lot of health authorities. So that's when my records request got in the way. So in terms of how that changes from state to state, yes, that does change from state to state, but your general question of are the private companies' communications with public entities accessible? Yes, generally speaking, yes, they are.
That is so great. What a great insight, that if you're covering something that's private, but there's a connection with a public agency, that's your way in. Brianne had a follow-up too. How do you request text messages? Which are up for grabs? Can you say request text between members of a police department?
Yes. So the text between members of a police department is absolutely, if they're on company issued phones and they relate to business, which in this case is being a police officer, then yes, those would be subject to release. Now, text messages, AKA SMS, is one of the harder types of documents records to get, because SMS this is in more recent years, they should be more accessible. But a lot of agencies will actually tell you it's not that you can't get it, it's that it's a pain in the ass for them to actually gather them, store them, and give them to you. But your response to that is like, okay, well, do you still have to give them to me? Okay, it's not my job if it's difficult for you. But anyway, like, just say that in a nicer way than I said it. But like, for the most part, they're going to be like, oh, I like SMS. There's actually an interesting situation, Cuomo, as you know, I keep bringing up Andrew Cuomo, but I'm a native New Yorker. I can't help it. It's fascinating. A bunch of reporters for a really, really, really long time have been trying to get that man's BlackBerry pin messages. So that's his version. I don't know why he's still using a BlackBerry. I don't know. He's an older gentleman. But anyway, they've been trying to get his pin messages, which is tantamount to like SMS. And for years, they've been saying that those are not privy to public records law, which I think is ripe for a legal challenge. I believe there's a couple of groups that are looking to try to actually force that into court. But once he got ousted, there was a lot of rumors about how a lot of his messages relating to his multiple scandals are actually contained within those messages. So you would the way you would request the text messages, like logistically in writing, is you would say text messages, SMS, between X and Y. And then I would actually spell out the numbers and the account names for those names. I try to be really, really specific when you're doing these, because if you just said to them, I want text messages for all of the NYPD, if they come back to you being like, that's unreasonable, they actually have a point, because NYPD has like what, 60,000 police officers and what text messages, and then you have to give them the time frame, and most likely you have to give them search terms. So for instance, if you wanted a case on, let's say Breonna Taylor, if you want a text messages relating to a no-knock warrant on Breonna Taylor, you would have to spell that out on that day, and then, try to narrow it. Try to make whoever's job it is to give you the records, their job easier rather than harder. I like to think of it as, imagine that you're giving instructions to a librarian, but the library is on fire and the library is not organized. You got to tell them where to go, what to pick, because trust me, they will get confused. I'm dealing with a situation right now where I'm telling the agency how to get their own records to give to me. And you're like, I feel like I'm in bizarro land. But yes, go ahead and try it. And I'd be super, super interested to see what you get back, Brianne, if you get any response back. I've never, out of my 100 requests, I've never requested SMS. I've always wanted to, but just because I want to doesn't mean I'm going to, because I haven't had a reason to. But yes, you can get SMS.
Paula, do you have any questions on that front with the work that you're doing? I don't know if you're still there, Paula. In the meantime, while you're maybe formulating your thoughts on that, if you want to answer, I have the students in this class, this intermediate reporting class, are all working on profiles right now. And I've asked them for Wednesday to think about their profile subjects and what potential public records they could look for or request. Now, some of it might be like disciplinary stuff that you can just get. Some of the disciplinary stuff in New York State on the New York State Department of State website is just publicly available. Some of it, like I think doctors, is a lot harder to get, but home health aides and that kind of thing, those you can get. So I have I wonder, among you students, you can get a little head start on your homework by throwing out some ideas for, if you're completely bamboozled by this, what requests would I conceivably ask for my person? Here's a chance to get a little homework help. Okay, Janet.
So for my profile, it was like a musician, classical musician, and so far I said I'd like to ask for his high school and college performance videos.
Okay, so Janet is profiling a student here at Stony Brook who is a classical musician and was wondering if she could get his high school or college performance videos.
I don't think you would need a records request for that. I think you would probably have the best luck going through Facebook, social media, and any other like YouTube or Vimeo sites like that. I will say though, I've always been the paranoid person whenever I do profiles. I really check the person out, because there were some instances where I was asked to profile when I was working at the daily newspaper in South Carolina, people with known criminal backgrounds. And I'm like, why am I profiling this person? So I would go ahead and do like Professor Selvin said, a check on to see if the person's ever been if they have a criminal record of some kind, although only if that's relevant, right? Just the fact that someone has a criminal record doesn't mean something's wrong with them. It's just everybody has histories. Your job as a reporter is to come into it knowing fully what that is. But in that situation, whenever you're looking for high school or any kind of what's called an education record, it's going to be really hard. So for instance, if you were applying for a job and I wanted to get your high school transcript, right? I couldn't file most of the time. I couldn't file a records request asking for a high school transcript. Why? There's a law called FERPA. You guys are probably aware of it, right? It's federal law about student privacy. It's actually really over applied by colleges when it comes to records requests, but FERPA is a real law that protects your privacy as a student in your education career. So you wouldn't be able to get stuff like that. But in terms of like that type of stuff, I think you're much better off asking the person to send you copies of their performance videos, or just looking for it yourself and combing through like all the social media websites. It'll work a lot faster than public records requests.
We have a couple more questions in the chat, or hands raised, I should say. So Sam, you want to ask, and then Christine?
Well, I think Christine had her hand up first, but
I think
Mine-
she already asked the question though. So
okay,
You go ahead.
Go ahead,
okay.
Sam.
Well, I just was wondering if, I mean, just quickly, if any states like make a distinction in terms of who is allowed to make records requests between private citizens and people who do they say you can only do it if you're a reporter who works for a known publication?
Right. Okay, that's a great question, actually. So when I said state laws vary wildly, I meant it. So for the most part, it doesn't matter who you are, with the caveat being there's about a handful of states, Virginia is one of them, that have implemented in recent years what's called a residency requirement, which means if you try to file a records request in Virginia says you need to be a Virginia resident to file a records request. Now, it's still, if you read the law really carefully, it doesn't say you have to be. It says the agency can choose to only respond to requests filed by Virginia residents. So we do a workaround for that whenever I have to do 50 state records request sprees. I actually have an editor who lives in Virginia file the request on my behalf. It's called I call it a surrogate filer. That's only about a handful of states. I'm forgetting the other ones on the top of my head, but if you just Google residency requirement records request states, you'll get a list of, I think, about maybe over 6 or so. It's a little over. Unfortunately, that law has gotten kind of popular over the years. So aside from that residency requirement, most of the time when you're filing a records request, they are not allowed to ask who you are, where you work for, or what the request is for. They might ask you just because they're curious, but you're typically not required to have to say it. So for instance, when I filed these records requests to Stony Brook, I did not identify myself. I just had my name, my number, and my personal email address because I wasn't doing it for my employer. So I didn't use my LA Times affiliations because it would make sense in that case. And they've never asked me, what is this request for? What are you planning to do with it, right? That's not something that's required. I will say, though, there are many times when it will be beneficial to you to identify yourself as news media. Many states will make it that once you identify yourself as news media, your request is then considered in the public interest. And what this does is it confers you a lot of extra benefits. So they might not charge you any fees when they give you the request, or this is more informal, they will treat your request much faster. Believe it or not, the vast majority of records requests are not filed by news media. They are filed by private entities. The vast bulk of records requests, I want to repeat this, are not by journalists. They're done by private citizens or private entities, usually they're looking for contracts that they didn't win, that they bid on, that they didn't win. And people are looking for documents related to why they didn't get the job that they applied for in public government. So most of those requests are like this. And then news media actually constitutes a very small fraction of those requests. But once you flag yourself as news media, they will care. It's a double-edged sword. They're gonna make sure everything they give you is hopefully up to snuff so that they're not like giving you too much. But then also they might be like, oh, we should process this faster so we can get this reporter off our back faster, which is typically what happens.
That's really interesting. Who knew? Okay, Christine, fire away.
Hello, I'm just calling back to something mentioned earlier, Jenny. When you talked about what was it, Stony Brook basically just not handing you information they very well could have, the bastards. I'm working on a story for the Statesman, which might potentially involve some similar interactions. So, I mean, obviously, like we have different admins, different points in time, but like from your experience, what do you think, like say Stony Brook student journalists should kind of steel themselves for in that kind of context, that kind of story?
Well, back in the day when I was a college student, many, many moons ago, I had to deal with this lovely woman named Lauren Shepro, who I believe us students used to refer to her as Stonewall Shepro, just to give you insight into how she was back when I was. I have to say though, in retrospect, and I told Professor Sullivan this, she was the best experience I could have had. Like she really set me up for a career in investigative journalism, whether that was her intent or not. I remember her just being really, really, really annoyed anytime I opened up my mouth, or like anytime. And I would be like, Lauren, why even hold a press conference if you don't want students to ask questions? But to your point, Stony Brook is by no means unique. You will find, honestly, what I've personally found is the more the institution, the more reputational damage the institution stands to lose, typically speaking, the less open they are. There are exceptions to every rule, but this happens all the time. You think Stony Brook is difficult to request a record from? Try the NYPD. Their average processing rate, the last I checked, was literally 2 to 3 years. For like a basic request, like if you wanted your own arrest record and you're like, I want my own arrest record, it'll still take you like 2 or 3 years. So always approach every records request with an open mind, even if it's the same agency you've requested before. I've had agencies that are known for being extremely transparent, like US Census Bureau, right? US Census Bureau is one of the few federal agencies that actually mans multiple hotlines to talk to reporters. They're known for being the most open, friendliest agency ever, right? I had to file a records request for them, which happened to be a completely separate division from all of their public relations division. They were terrible. It was one of the worst requests I've ever filed. That was the one that they tried to charge me, I think initially $6,000, then they negotiated down to $3,000. Then I got it for $0. What a great sale, huh? But anyway, like to your point, I just never know where they're gonna go, and I think that's the interest in it. It's just like reporting in any other element, but just be prepared for them to always say no. I go into every interaction assuming that they're going to say no, even routine ones that are not a big deal, and so you've got to be prepared to like just get back. I don't know if I answered your question, but Stony Brook is not by any means unique. If anything, I know there's been a lot of recent stories lately about like Ivy League schools like Harvard and Princeton and them having worse, same, if not worse situations with public records requests. And they have, paid staff at their student newspapers, a lot of those schools.
They're private though.
Yeah.
They're not subject to the same disclosures as a state university system, would they be?
It really depends. For instance, for Title IX, you're required to respond to those if you take federal funding, is my understanding. And so that would include a lot of private universities, even if you're not public. But yeah, I mean, some of them will respond to records requests, other times not. It really depends. And it's also like with Stony Brook, I'm sure you guys know, the university is open to records requests, but it's been in limbo for a really long time, whether the Stony Brook Foundation, which is where a lot of the university's fundraising money comes through, is subject to records requests. And I know Newsday has tried to fight that a lot of times in the past. I don't know where that is now, but that would be interesting for you guys if you guys wanted to look into that. So that's where all the interesting stuff is.
Yeah, where money goes. And Sam has a good follow-up question. Does the same apply to companies with ongoing government contracts?
So the way most records laws work is that you have to locate the agency that you think has the document you want. So in this instance, you're interested in a company that is let's say a federal contractor with, let's say, Homeland Security or something, right? You're not going to be able to go to that company and be like, you're a federal contractor, now you're subject to FOIA. That's not how it works, right? It needs to be a public agency. So in this case, you would go to the Department of Homeland Security and then file a records request asking for information on that company. And then it's going to depend on what type of record you're requesting and what type of company and what kind of contract that is, what kind of stuff you can get. But for sure, that's what I'm doing right now. I'm actually working on, I'm involved in my first ever FOIA lawsuit, something I've wanted for a long time, and now I'm finally in it. It's a pain in the ass, but it's great. But I'm dealing with that situation right now because we're looking at ICE, the immigration detention, and almost all of the detention contracts are with private companies that are federally contracted with ICE to provide information. That doesn't mean I can't get anything. It does limit what I can get, but because it has that tether to the federal government, there's quite a lot I can get. So yes, it does apply to companies. Just make sure you go to the agency, not the company. Because if you go to the company will be like, what the hell? Like, they're not required to do it. But yeah, one thing I didn't talk about today is when you're looking for things to request, for more complicated requests, I will do a little bit reporting beforehand so that, I'll make some
You just
calls.
froze. We just lost you.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say, before
Okay, we lost you for a second, Jenny. We have
Okay.
about 2 minutes left.
I think that might
so
be
you-
on their end.
Okay.
I was
You were
just gonna
saying,
say, yeah, when I am about to file a complicated request, I will do some reporting ahead of time, make some calls, talk to some people to figure out what records exist that I'm interested in and where they might be and what they might be named, et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes it's as simple as filing a request in 2 minutes because you already know what you want. And other times it's a new database I've never heard of or known about. So I will actually go and do some reporting and actually be able to describe what I want in more detail. So sometimes it takes a little while to get there. Those are the more complicated ones.
question on this end, are there any international guidelines about filing requests?
That's a great question. So yes, the United States is not the only country with a records request law. In fact, a bunch of other countries, and it's not just the United States and it's not strictly, let's say, fully democratic countries that have this. I was actually, some person on Twitter was like, oh, like China doesn't have a records law. Actually, China does have a records law. It works differently than the United States FOIA, but they have their own terms for how you can get public records as well. So France has one too. Like a bunch of countries have their own version of a public records or open meetings law, and they will outline kind of what you can get, how you can request it and how it works. So you're going to want to go and do research for that particular country and figure out how that process works. More or less, most of the processes work kind of the way that I outlined it in the presentation. But yeah, you're just going to have to do a little bit more research on that.
I've just unmuted myself. I was just saying thank you. I guess we have to leave it there. It's the end of our class period. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.